We're currently experiencing a global pandemic as I write this, one that's forcing us to find new remote ways of working and socialising in order to stay afloat and to stay sane. Businesses have moved online, shops, services and leisure centres are closed for the foreseeable future, people have either died, lost their jobs or taken pay cuts, and governments are practically tripping over themselves to keep the world stable. It's a scary time at the minute, and there's no denying that the world is going to be irrevocably changed from this point on. Not least of which because this will also positively affect people's lives. The economy is learning it doesn't have to be running things the way it has for the last 20 or so years to function, and I don't doubt that having 3 months off of work, something millions of people won't have experienced in decades, will inspire new career decisions and discoveries about themselves. Even something as basic as the release of new films moving straight to video-on-demand services, sending a very specific message to distributors all around the world that you no longer have to necessarily release your movie in cinemas for financial profit, is yet another signal that we're quickly approaching the climax of one point in time and the beginning of another. I bring all of this up because it kind of feels as if the end of an era is upon us. And when this struck me, I couldn't help but realise a common, perhaps prophetic theme throughout many of the movies released in 2019, which, right now, for all we know, may well end up being the last full year we all went to the movies. The Avengers fought one last battle, for the time being. 2 bookworms sought one last chance to be high school teenagers in Booksmart. The Millennium Falcon led one last assault against the evil empire, for the time being. A couple struggled to raise a son during a stormy divorce settlement a la the end of their marriage. Woody the cowboy asked himself, what do I do now that the Toy Story is over? Frank Sheeran got all retrospective in what frankly feels like Martin Scorsese's swan song for his gangster movies of old. Disney tried to literally end cinema as we knew it. You get the idea. 2019 was brimming at the seams with this focus on finality. It was the end of all the things that you knew and loved. Which may just be why I, for whatever reason, was convinced during my initial viewing of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that I was in fact experiencing Quentin Tarantino's final movie. I was not, but we'll get back to that. Set in 1969 Los Angeles following 3 characters, 2 of which are fictional bit-part TV performers nearing the end of their heyday, and the other being up-and-coming real-life actress Sharon Tate, who's just now finding herself blossoming into a promising career, the film is ripe with suggestions of eras coming to their ends. As the movie plays, Tarantino takes a shockingly reserved and mannered approach to the story, which is to say there really isn't much of one. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Rick Dalton, a 50s primetime television actor who suffers something of a midlife crisis when he's advised to begin starring in spaghetti westerns lest he fade into obscurity. While his stuntman and best friend, Cliff Booth, played by Brad Pitt, does odd jobs for Rick now that no one will hire him. The film follows them and Rick's new next-door neighbour Sharon Tate, played by Margot Robbie, as the 3 effectively go about their days independently and whose lives weave in and out of one another. But narratively, that's pretty much the extent of what Once Upon a Time seeks to achieve. We hold on Cliff as he leisurely drives from point A to point B, or when he climbs a roof to fix an aerial antenna. I mean, the view ain't bad. We linger on Rick as he desperately tries to deliver a great performance on set, or when he verbally abuses himself in confidence after screwing up a take, and we enter a movie theatre with Sharon as she explains who she is to the ticket usher, takes a photograph with the cinema manager, and sits down to do little more than kick her feet up to watch herself on the big screen, with an audience of cinema attendees as eager as herself. While Once Upon a Time may seem oddly slow, lacking any narrative purpose or providing any good forward momentum, what it successfully does is give this feeling of wasted time. We're only given a few introductory scenes before the film prepares its thesis statement. Within minutes we're presented with a sequence from one of Rick's movies titled The 14 Fists of McCluskey, featuring him heroically wielding a flamethrower against a bunch of Nazis in World War II era Germany. A very funny moment no doubt and a crucial setup, but something also feels very intentional about it. The enemy, the set dressing, the general imagery. Anyone familiar with Tarantino's work can't help but liken the sequence to the climax of Inglourious Basterds, the director's 7th film. While the resemblance appears at first glance as a humorous nod, its existence paradoxically clues the audience in on a key thematic concept. And if you haven't seen the film, take this as your warning, I'm about to spoil the big finale. The ending of Inglourious Basterds is all about the weaponization of film as a force for good, both in the narrative and the literal sense. Our heroes in the movie use celluloid to burn down a cinema in which several Nazi leaders sit enjoying a propaganda film. The fire is used to do little more than scare them into a sheer panic before the bastards mercilessly gun them all down. While the historical inaccuracy is something that may well upset some people, the fictional imagery of Adolf Hitler getting obliterated by machine guns creates an almost transcendent effect on its audience, eliciting a kind of visceral response that gives the film a certain power. By the end of the movie, the audience has gotten the same taste of revenge that characterized the whole story. Who doesn't want to see Hitler obliterated by machine guns? And while for the most part Once Upon a Time is nowhere near as over the top as Inglourious Basterds, Tarantino inviting his audience to recall a film which takes a purposely fictional lens to horrific real-life events from the past in order to evoke certain ideas about the power of film through film offers an insight into where the movie's headspace just might be at. You see, there was an interesting correlation at the point where Once Upon a Time is set, going on between Hollywood and the world outside its doors. The American lifestyle of the nuclear family in the 1950s had become outdated, with politically polarizing events like the Vietnam War inspiring a countercultural revolution. Americans had become increasingly disillusioned, and it brought about a new lifestyle surrounding civil rights activism, recreational drug use, and sexual experimentation. And while this had a gradual knock-on effect in the world of movies, with auteur filmmakers slowly introducing contemporary risk-filled projects which challenged the norms of mainstream movie making, emphasizing relevant socio-political undertones, depicting lead characters ambiguously, and displaying violent realism, Hollywood's output was still largely composed of the same old-guard, middle-brow escapist fluff that characterized its golden age, and which did not reflect a decade largely defined by the JFK assassination. It was within this kind of increasingly anachronistic media that Sharon Tate began to make an impression in the film industry, acting in small roles opposite leads like Jack Palance and Dean Martin, and often being described as a beautiful and exciting on-screen personality. During this time, Tate went through an extensive publicizing process to spread her name and create the appearance of an emergent figure in Hollywood to look out for. And with her then recent marriage to Rosemary's Baby director Roman Polanski, along with the release of a documentary titled All Eyes on Sharon Tate, plus a tight-knit circle of friends that included the likes of Steve McQueen, Warren Beatty, and Jane Fonda, all the pieces were in place for the makings of another classic movie star. But while this age of filmmaking in the Hollywood scene had already been on its way out as early as 1963 with the collapse of the studio system, it would take something of an earthquake to shake it into the same headspace as the rest of the world. That day came when things hit just a little too close to home on August 9th, 1969 in Los Angeles, when 3 cultists ordered by Charles Manson broke into Sharon and Roman's home. While Polanski was in Europe at the time, Tate was 8.5 months pregnant, hosting 3 other friends. The 4 of them were brutally assaulted and murdered. In the years to follow, the Manson family massacre would go on to be known for defining Hollywood's motivation to finally get with the times. People within the industry itself, many of whom knew the Polanskis personally, were panic-buying new security systems and bearing firearms for their own safety, which naturally had an effect on its output. There was no cultural ignorance anymore. Out went the glamour, in came world weariness. It ushered in the more politically minded paranoia of 70s media and what we nowadays refer to as new wave cinema. And the days of blissful innocence, of simple good versus evil genre fare, crowd-pleasing musicals and Dean Martin comedies in which Tate was only just finding her feet, was long behind it. Even if you're unfamiliar with these events, Tarantino's tasteful sprinkling in of the bizarre and disturbing Manson cultists, amidst mostly lounging in the company of his likeably comedic and breezy main characters, unaware that they don't have long before their world changes for good, creates a Hitchcockian sense of foreboding. When Cliff visits Spawn Ranch, the old backlot from his primetime TV series Bounty Law, now taken over by the Manson family, the film's genre briefly turns on its head into something more akin to a cynical thriller. The golden colours are left behind in exchange for uncertain, grim darkness. He quite literally steps from one era into another. At the time of the film's release, I remember there was a lot of discussion and critique surrounding the fact that Robbie's Sharon Tate says very little dialogue in the film. While it's true that Robbie isn't as verbal as her male co-stars here, although she's by no means silent the whole way through, I actually think Tarantino's use of the character may be the most thoughtful tribute to Tate's memory in decades. While the more obvious thing to do may be to flesh her out, the film's lack of introspection solidifies Sharon as a pure symbol more than a character. Naive, exciting, and sporting a childlike wonder, she embodies the wide-eyed youth of old Hollywood, a beautiful figure of simple, unguarded innocence. That Tarantino chooses not to dig deeper into that character, revealing all the more realistic flaws that may come with her, speaks to that thematic metaphor. This of course sets the stage for a fairly unpleasant third act, with our two fictional characters acting as audience surrogates, bearing witness to these tragic events only meters from their front door. We watch as the film painfully takes its time building the tension, having the Manson family slowly approach the neighborhood, discuss their intentions of killing everyone in the Tate household, and Cliff even briefly leaving Rick and his wife helpless to walk his dog. The viewer can only hold their breath in anticipation of a grim finale. But then something interesting happens. Suddenly, things start to go a different way. In response to a drunken Rick telling them to get their car off private property, the Mansons later decide to divert from the original plan and to kill the actor they watched on TV as kids, Rick Dalton, presumably along with anyone else that may be unfortunate enough to be in the premises. Luckily for Rick and his wife, a very much high on acid Cliff returns just in time before the Mansons arrive at their front door. And the film becomes, well, what else? A Quentin Tarantino movie. In what is the only violent sequence in the whole film, we watch as Cliff beats all three of them to a bloody pulp, with a drunk, startled Rick reacting to the last one left alive by, well... You really can't do that moment justice by simply describing it. Aside from being one of Tarantino's most hilarious uses of comic violence, it also becomes his most purposeful. Holding on Cliff as he smashes this woman's head in repeatedly is funny for a reason. It takes every ounce of menace and threat away from real-life monsters and replaces it with pathetic humiliation, reducing any power they may have had in the first place. And it is funny, the scene just keeps on going. It becomes so suddenly over the top, the only thing you can do is start laughing. Never mind the sheer indulgence that is Rick burning the third to a crisp with a flamethrower that inexplicably still has fuel in it as triumphant operatic music swells into the foreground. In the following scene, the commotion of a survived but beaten up Cliff being taken away by ambulance is noticed by Sharon and her friends, who invite Rick up to join them for a drink to cool off. As the film closes on the inference that Rick's career may in fact find a form of renewed success through the implied friendship between him and the now very much alive Sharon Tate, it couldn't be more fitting that Tarantino chooses this moment to display his title. And this is why, whether intentional or not, the reference to Inglourious Basterds at the start of the film feels so fitting, making the controversial decision to give the audience what they would much rather prefer to see again here, rather than what actually happened in real life, which again invites critique in and of itself, creates a similar effect but with a different purpose, and is alluded to earlier on when we see a match cut between footage of Rick in Steve McQueen's The Great Escape to Sharon approaching the movie theatre. Tarantino has crafted a loving ode to the escapism of the movies. We have enjoyed hanging out in LA with these funny and likeable characters, and for 2 hours 40 minutes, we're able to live in that world again, with a crescendo of a finale that sees old-fashioned heroes defeating and humiliating pure, unadulterated evil. Like its wartime-set spiritual predecessor, it casts a similarly powerful spell on its audience that transcends the confines of the cinema screen. A spell of immersion and escapist make-believe that transports us back to a time when, well, as the film sees it, before it all went to shit. It makes the case that Hollywood didn't willingly hand over its golden age, but had it taken by force. The Once Upon a Time in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is to be taken literally. This is a fantasy fairy tale about the end of an era. less interested in factual reenactments, as it is in exploiting the power of film to reinforce an innocence Hollywood was once robbed of in reality, using its medium to recall a time when the stars were bright, the world was young and exciting, and so were we. For all that Once Upon a Time gets right, it is not Tarantino's final movie, and I think an argument could be made that it really should have been. It only made sense for a film all about coming to the finish line to also be one in the literal sense, capping his entire filmography off where we come round full circle with an end that is also a beginning. Despite going on record in the past to say that he'd like to end on his 10th feature, which this is, apparently he considers the 2 Kill Bill movies to be just one, so I guess we have another project to look forward to. Whether or not Quentin believes that, I choose to see this as his anticipation of closing the book. From the overarching theme of its main story, to the reverent callbacks to his previous work, and most importantly, the most restrained and humbled his filmmaking style has ever been, the film plays like a fitting conclusion of all sorts. An oddly understated but equally sentimental meta-farewell to the joyous exuberance of not only old Hollywood, but the age of Tarantino movies itself. It may not be around forever, but when it leaves, it's certainly going out with a bang. And in a time perhaps as uncertain today as things may have been in 1969, where we're far away from our loved ones, have lost friends to an invisible enemy, and are scared, struggling to figure out where we're going to go next, it's comforting to know that if nothing else, if we ever need to get out of this hellhole reality, we need simply leave all that behind and trade it in to willingly lose ourselves in a good movie. Because as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood argues, that is its true defining power. Thanks for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like this kind of content, please do let me know. I hope everyone's looking after themselves. If you're watching this video around the time it was published, please, I implore you, stay indoors as much as you can. It's really important that we're all, following this rule. I know it's tough, but like the main subject of the video, my hope is that this kept you pleasantly distracted for 15 odd minutes. Thanks again for watching, and if you like what you see, you can subscribe to the channel for more. Look after yourselves. Cheers.